Hello, welcome. All right, so let me get the names down. Are there any questions as I'm writing the names down? So we're doing antebellum westward expansion. Please feel free to unmute yourself and speak if you do. All right. So then now what I want to do is I want to share the screen and go to the assignment itself. All right. So as far as a narrative, right, and in an argumentative format, what I wanted to do is revolve it around Turner's thesis of the West, right? Frederick Jackson Turner in the 1890s, later on, beyond this time period. But it dealt with American exceptionalism, that America is a special country. It's an exceptional country, and especially by way of the safety valve that we call the West. He contended, right, that the West is going to safeguard and ensure the future for Americans of economic equality of opportunity. All right, that was it was kind of all about, was equality of economic opportunity. And how did he go about doing that? Well, for one, right, is he contended that the West was riddled with like equalizers, right, if you will, equalizers. And the two broad categories that I derived from his writing were dangers and opportunities. Okay. And so central to his thesis is the idea that the dangers that were inherent in the West, as well as the opportunities that were found in the imperialistic endeavors to the West, put everyone on relatively equal footing. And that's argumentative. Some people don't like his thesis. Some people don't like the assumption that a almost geographic determinism, that a rugged frontier does offer equality of opportunity necessarily. They look at other frontiers like in Siberia, in South America, and contend that didn't produce automatically an egalitarian society. It didn't put everyone on equal footing. When you look at the Pampas region of Argentina, etc. So, and then not only that, it has a clear omission when it comes to post-civil rights movement historiography. When post-civil rights movement historians look at certain demographics that had been termed minority groups, right, during the civil rights era, African Americans, Native Americans, women, etc., Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and noted that there was not equality of opportunity for those demographics, as you see on number 2. So number 1 is going to try to give him credit where credit is due. And so you're looking kind of at court history, the West having a salutary, a healthy, a wonderful effect on economic institutions, on political institutions, on the culture, and on what represents America, right? That the West ensured that Americana would be all about equality of opportunity. So when you look at the West, I'm tempted to look at the overland trails. In the 1820s, there was a big fur rush economically. And you had what started off as monopolies in the coast of Washington. And you had people in the Idaho Valley and around the Dales here. And they came in as private entities trying to get into the Native American trade on furs with beaver and otter, etc. Right? because at one time, stated a source that I had read, in the 1820s, the profit margin could go as high as 800%, 800, for how much it costs to acquire a fur in North America and how much you could sell the final product of that fur in China, for instance. So at any rate, it started off, and then it kind of it arguably democratizes. By the end of the 1820s, you have people like Manuel Lisa, and the gentleman in the that opened up the Willamette Valley for Americans, the German immigrant, John Jacob Astor, that had Astoria in Oregon named after him. And they came in and they tried to, make it more of an open capitalist market on the furs. They hired people from all backgrounds, all nationalities. They tried to get people on the East Coast through the press to come and volunteer and work as employees, promising them riches and opportunities, etc. And so what had once been kind of the privilege of the few, with like the Hudson Bay Company, some of the French Coureurs de Bois, the runners of the forest, the French fur trappers, they kind of lose their monopoly as Euro-Americans, because the Native Americans were in on this long before, obviously. They kind of lose their monopoly by the 1830s, whereby masses of American citizens and immigrants are flooding into the West to take advantage of this opportunity. And then in the beginning of the 1840s, you also have the narrative of the missionary groups, right? And with the missionary groups, especially the Baptists and the Methodists, especially the Methodists, actually, they ran programs on the East Coast, as did the Congregationalists of New England, etc., for the evangelization of the West, trying to make it Christian, convert the Native Americans and the settlers there in the Western region. As a matter of fact, they were even part of these private and philanthropic organizations that included foreign missions. They treated the West almost like a foreign country that was heathen oriented, right? That was non-Christian and kind of barbarian, and they were going to civilize it. And so you have people like Marcus and Narcissa Whitman, Whitman, and their writings and their propaganda for evangelizing the West, particularly Oregon, really caught fire on the East. There was even an anecdotal story of a couple Native Americans, Nez Perce, who traveled as far east as Chicago or St. Louis, and contended that they wanted to see the white man's great book, the Bible, that is. And I'm not even sure on the veracity of that story, but that story moved around the rumor mill all throughout the East Coast. So the 1840s, you had an exodus of people beginning in 1843, moving down across as well. And at this time, you have the mountain men, as they were generically called, like the runners of the forest, and the men connected to the fur trapping companies, began to sell the rights to their stories. So, I mean, it goes back to a guy named Robert Stewart, who had an infamous trip from Oregon during the War of 1812 back to the East Coast. And I mean, just every dramatic thing that you could imagine almost with the common narratives on the West is found in his story. People so thirsty, they were drinking their own urine, bear attacks, being stopped and blackmailed by the Crow Native American tribe, and to give their stuff to them or else they would kill them. Mutiny, drawing straws or getting close to doing such, as far as killing and eating one another out of desperation for food. And so those stories sold. And believe it or not, you would think that might be a deterrent for people wanting to move to the West, but the kind of, the exoticism of it and so forth seemed to have its pull during the 1840s. And so you had people selling their rights to their stories and also offering themselves up as chauffeurs, if you will, as scouts, to help people make it safely through the far West, into the far West. And by that time, from the Native Americans initially, And from a few famous mountain men, you have the establishment and the federal subsidization of the overland trails, where they began actually establishing military forts, supply stores, maps, guns, flour, tools, feed, etc. Right, along the overland trails. And the famous ones, right, were the Oregon Trail. Coming from the Oregon Trail was the California, or also known as the Mormon Trail. And then you have the Santa Fe Trail to the south, which you don't quite see on that map. I should have had a better map that showed all three. But at any rate, you have with this a kind of an amalgamation of many forces that are all adding to interest in and migration to into the far west. And then you also have the Mexican loss of Texas in 1836. Mexico was going to lose the state of Texas to a group of Anglo, primarily Scots-Irish, North American Yankees. And then from after 36, of course, 10 years later was the Mexican-American War from 1846 to 1848. And the U.S. is going to grab the rest of the West, along with the Gadsden Purchase, to finish it off and take all of the West. And then the Oregon and the Ohio Valley, the Idaho Valley, that's going to be ceded by Great Britain to the United States. And so when you look at, Chicano history, it's a story of the masses coming in as kind of a Trojan horse, coming in, and they're supposed to assimilate when they went into Mexican Texas. And they primarily did not, according to the primary sources, follow the Mexican rules and laws. And that's going to add to the friction and to the war of independence in Texas, and to friction between the United States and Mexico that would ultimately culminate in the Mexican-American War. But so and then of course, the timing, right? The Mexican-American War ended by way of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo on February 2nd, 1848. And gold was, quote, discovered in the Sacramento Valley. I believe it was January 24th. So literally like 8 days before the end of the war, gold was found. So no sooner had that land been taken by the United States, primarily California, Nevada, Utah, Colorado, Arizona, New Mexico, is it taken by the United States. But shortly thereafter, or immediately thereafter, people flooded into the far west, especially the gold rush. The year of 1849, with the famous 49ers, 80,000 people registered across the overland trails alone. Those are just who registered across overland trails, not counting others who came by way of Panama, under South America, and across the Pacific Ocean. So, so at any rate, he kind of glosses over conflict theory, right? And focusing upon, taking this land from Native Americans, taking this land from Mexico. But instead, he just looks at the dangers and the opportunities that were inherently found in the West. So looking at that, right, it's very selective history. You look at the overland trails, and like I mentioned with the trip of Robert Stewart, my goodness, you have the Snake River, the Columbia River, the Platte River, whereby a lot of people drown. You have the Mandan Mountains, the Sierra Nevada, the Rockies, where a lot of people perished. Although I want to qualify that claim, when they look at the stats, the mortality stats, officially, the mortality rates were relatively low compared to those who registered going across and how many died, etc. Oftentimes it's put around 5%. But like I said, those are just the ones registered. I have a feeling it was higher than that. And so you have the topographical and geographical concerns. You have historians like Candy Moulton and other historians who focus on like the barbarism of the West and their old history books of the West. And they literally give names of people like with cattle companies who came across to the West to find the roaming cattle that were found, particularly in Texas and in the southern part of the West. People being gored by cattle and killed by bison, by the hundreds of thousands, if not more than that, of roaming bison. The weather, the travails of the weather. And then you have your Native American tribes, the Crow, the Blackfoot, the Shoshone. And of course, in the South, you had the Apache and the Comanche and the Navajo, tribes that developed fearsome reputations for fighting against any trespassers through their land. And so you can find evidence of and remember, the nature of this is that he's contending that these dangers are rather egalitarian, that it doesn't matter who you were on the West. It doesn't matter how much money you had, what family connections you had. You would just as easily, by the law of physics, drowned in the Platte River as would a poor person from the East Coast. You could just as easily become susceptible to a Native American gun or bow and arrow just as easily as a poorer counterpart from the East Coast. So that this supposedly put people on relatively equal footing, these dangers that are found in the West. Another part of that narrative is anarchy, or literally like the lack of governing institutions. And you do have that for windows of time. You have that through the gold rush, right? When you look at your gold rush histories, you find evidence of vigilante or vigilance and minor associations, just kind of grassroots organizations of miners who decided to join up together and write codes of laws and enforce them by having trials and executions at times of the culprits, of the suspects. And so, why would they have to do that if there weren't, if there were no police and sheriff departments yet? The Land Survey Office was supposed to open up and put everything into 6 square acre plots and sell them as public domain out on the capitalist system, out on the free market. James K. Polk, the president during the gold rush, contended, you guys go ahead and take it. Whatever minerals you find, it's free for the taking. So he kind of encouraged a mad dash approach to California during the gold rush. And then, of course, you're going to have Hispanics and others who are going to contend, hey, this has been my land for multiple generations. And now all these Anglos are coming and squatting on it, and they're refusing to leave. And so that's kind of conveniently, that facet of the story is kind of conveniently set aside by Turner. And he focuses instead, like I said, on opportunities to gain land and opportunities that are entrepreneurial in nature. The Mormons, for instance, they instituted a ferry business and charged people to ferry them across a few famous rivers. And, Levi Strauss with his Levi pants, the Chinese engendered a lot of resentment because of how well they did on an entrepreneurial basis, not only in the mines, but selling goods and services to the miners. I call it mining the miners, right? You look for an opportunity of something they want for amusement, whether it be gambling houses, opium dens, brothels, restaurants, inns, etc., and try to take their money from them that way. And so, and then also you have early accounts of 1848, especially. You look at the California Mexican American newspaper, the Alta California, and other newspapers like it. And they're going to contend that the people that initially got there early literally found clumps of gold. And they didn't need any capital to begin with. And they didn't need any special tools or machinery. They could just get it at the superficial level. They called it placer mining, superficial level mining, right from the riverbeds, etc. So at any rate, you have, that's the narrative of number one, is that, you have equal dangers that put people on relatively equal footing, and you had equal opportunities that put people on relatively equal terms as well. And so almost in Darwinian fashion, if you were tough enough, if you were lucky enough, if you were ingenious enough to think of some type of entrepreneurial plan, you could make it in the West. You could remake yourself. You could make something of yourself. Virtually anyone could, suggest Frederick Jackson Turner. All right. So are there any questions with number one? Am I still on number one? I don't think so. Number two, a glimpse into 19th century Anglo-Hispanic relations dispels the myth of Turner's thesis. And so when you look here, you not only have the facts, like I said, with Mexican Texas, the Mexican government offered 4,428 acres. They're on the metric system, a different system. That's why it seems like a random amount of acreage. But over 4,400 acres of land for virtual free. If they lived under the impresario or the local governing Anglo in Eastern Texas, Stephen Austin. And Stephen Austin was to charge them 6 cents an acre when when land cost on the public domain back in the U.S. $1.25 an acre, 6 cents versus $1.25. And then sometimes, evidently, Mr. Austin even waived that 6 cent fee and gave the land outright for free. But in return, you were supposed to learn Spanish. You were supposed to become Roman Catholic. You were to abide by Mexican laws. Also, you had 7 years exemption from trading with the U.S. and having it taxed. So tax-free international trade, and 10 years freedom from domestic taxes. And so, wow, I mean, this was a great inducement to Anglos to come in. Within just a 10-year span, according to Mexican reports, the Anglos began to outnumber the Tejanos, the ethnically Mexican Texans, 10-1. And so when they came in and did this, right, they had a couple issues with the Mexican government, but the main one being a trial by jury. They wanted trial by jury. They didn't want to have to be brought all the way to Coahuila, just beneath Texas, right, a northern Mexican state, because the state itself was an interior province belonging to Mexico City, and it was known as Coahuila and Tejas. And so their state legislature and representation, their criminal courts, etc., all were in Saltillo, Coahuila, rather than up in Texas. So they had a problem with that. But they had a great constitution that was very much like the U.S. Constitution in the form of the 1824 liberal Constitution of Mexico. But then as time goes on, Mexico is going to have multiple coups, multiple civil wars, the scrapping of the previous constitution and the implementation of a new constitution, and so forth. Mexico is going to be very tumultuous. There's a guy named David Wasserman who has a book on everyday life in 19th century Mexico, and he gives just all the details in his book on one leader after another. And oftentimes it was on account of the political spectrum being more broad down in Mexico. The liberals were more liberal than they were up here, and the conservatives were more conservative than they were up here. So there was a great gulf between the two. You know, when you have groups of people who want literally an emperor like Agustin Iturbide and no representative government, and then you have leaders who wanted to dole out the representation and land to the common people and give political citizenship to all men of all colors and ethnic backgrounds, etc., like Vicente Guerrero. And so a big gulf. And so Mexico's early, history from 1821 through 1848, they almost had as many presidents or leaders as there were years between 21 and 48. And that's hardly an exaggeration. And so why am I saying this is it made Mexico vulnerable, preoccupied, having its own problems down south. And this was known as La Frontera. It was 1,000 miles away, up into the north. And so there wasn't a lot of attention given to Texas. There weren't enough migrants and settlers from Mexico proper that were inhabiting Texas and the other states for that matter, like Arizona and California and New Mexico, etc. And so at any rate, a guy named Mier y Terán came up and gave a report on the state of Texas, and his report was gloomy and said that the gringos there were defiant, were doing very successfully, but would, if left to their own devices, secede from Mexico, would leave. And so hence there was great danger and a great need to bring in more trustworthy Mexican citizens into Texas and to make the Anglos that were there in Stephen Austin's zone toe the line and abide by Mexican law and statutes. And one of those rules that they were defying was by the early 1830s, slavery had been prohibited in Mexico. Yeah, they were over 30 years ahead of us, or about 30 years ahead of us. And so the Scots Irish and other immigrants coming from Tennessee and the deep south of Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia coming in, they were Southerners in the true sense of the word. They were kind of libertarian. Government don't tread on me. Let me do what I want, including let me have my own slaves and make my own money without taxing or bothering me. And so it was kind of a recipe for disaster. And so Austin comes down into Mexico, pleads with the Mexican government to revoke its April, what was it, April 5th or April 1st decree. It's April decrees, basically, saying that no more gringos could come into Texas. Those who were not abiding by Mexican law were to be deported, and other strictures against them and have their slaves taken from them, etc. And when he did so, he was arrested under kind of tension and a misunderstanding with the president, who was Gomez Farias at the time of Mexico. So Gomez Farias had Stephen Austin, this middleman, if you will, this liaison between the Mexican people and government and the Americans, arrested, and in came the Warhawks under Sam Houston and other people, right? A guy, the last name of Henry, and then there was William Barrett Travis and others. So at any rate, the final straw was when Gomez Farias was removed from power by a coup by General Santa Anna. And Santa Anna is going to implement his, I think it was Bases Orgánicas was the name. He had a couple different constitutions that he implemented at different times, but it was very much more conservative than the 1824 Constitution that the Anglo-Texans were accustomed to. The 1824 Constitution allowed limited state sovereignty, limited local sovereignty to do as they pleased. This one now made each state and interior region, including Texas and Coahuila, a department of the federal government. And no longer was the governor of each state to be elected and the state legislators to have the same power that they'd once had. Now these handpicked governors by Santa Anna himself could override local state, regional state laws and handpicked some of their own local men. And so it did, really threaten representative government and local government, this Bases Orgánicas new constitution. And then also he commandeered the state militia. Remember, if you're a good Southern libertarian, you are big on your Second Amendment rights. And now all militias at every local level belong directly to Santa Anna, and he could conscript them to fight for his army at any time he wants. So there was a governor of Zacatecas, Mexico, and he refused to step down to the new handpicked governor. And Santa Anna conscripted an army of people primarily from the Mexico City area and brought them in to crush the state militia of Zacatecas. And he gave a warning that Texas and Coahuila were next if they didn't step down and acknowledge his new constitution. And there was largely at this time a kind of a bifurcation. A lot of Tejanos, ethnic Mexicans, stepped down at this last minute, and a lot of people from Coahuila joined to Texas, stepped down in Saltillo as well. But especially the Anglo-Eastern Texas region said they were not going to give up, and they were not going to give in. And so at any rate, he began marching his army toward Texas. And that's when they began to try to preemptively take as many presidios or military forts as they could. Okay, sorry. So at any rate, they took over a military fort in several places, but in one of them, they took over a cannon, and one of the Mexican regiments that were going ahead of Santa Anna's army demanded that they give the cannon over, and they shot the cannon at the Mexican army men. And this was Prefecto de Cos, a brother-in-law of Santa Anna. So Prefecto de Cos, he came down to Santa Anna and told him what happened. And Santa Anna, declared that he was going to deal harshly with them. And so that's where you have the Alamo incident, right, of around 200 people confining themselves and an old cotton mill and mission and forming a presidio out of it in San Antonio, Texas. And they tried to hold on, and Santa Anna declared degüello, like a fight to the death. He would take no prisoners, and he stood by that. And then at a nearby Goliad, he tricked, well, they were tricked, the people at Goliad, who they'd heard about the fate of those in the Alamo. And it also helped the cause that some of the people in the Alamo had become quite famous. So their deaths appeared to be almost like martyrdoms. So James Bowie and especially Davy Crockett, amongst others. So at any rate, they're going to give up at Goliad, promised by the local commander that they could be given mercy, clemency. And Santa Anna said no, and Santa Anna had them publicly executed. So William Barrett Travis had sent a letter or a circular out to the American press and calling on all liberty-loving Anglo-Americans to come and take this beautiful country from this backward, tyrannical Mexican government. And so people flooded in to help Sam Houston's army. And with Sam Houston and his men, they kind of abided by the art of war dictum, that you not only fight your enemy when he's divided, but sometimes at points you hit him where he knows he's the strongest, and he'll put his guard down. And that's what they did. The three armies of Santa Anna met at Buena Vista, right? Not Buena Vista, at San Jacinto River. And they thought there's no way they could get attacked with all three armies together. And in the early hours of the morning, that's exactly what happened. They were attacked. Santa Anna was taken by Houston's men, and he signed over in return for his life Texas to this army. And so Texas from 1836 to 1845 was its own Lone Star Republic, kind of unique amongst the states of American history. And from 36 to 45, not even Andrew Jackson would touch this issue of Texas. And so it remained its own country. But leading to that, right, Polk arguably picked a fight as the presidential candidate for the Democratic Party. He said he wanted California. He tried Poinsett to purchase California, and the Mexicans were so affronted, the government that is, that we even tried to buy California, that he had to leave as the ambassador to that country. But we quibbled with them over the border. We contended that it was the Rio Bravo del Norte or the Rio Grande or Rio Grande, and they contended that it was the Nueces River. And so at any rate, we sent men into that contested region between the Nueces and the Rio Grande. And of course, it's ironic because that is some of the least productive land on the North American continent that we end up fighting for. And in that contested area between the rivers is where Americans were supposedly fired upon. A cavalry unit was fired upon, and an up-teen number of American soldiers were killed. So that's where President Polk, who plays kind of the white devil in Chicano history books, came in and asked American Congress to declare war against Mexico, saying that American blood has been shed on American soil. And so it was a very controversial war with that generation. You can make the argument from those who were elected into Congress and that person who was elected into the White House, who made it very clear that he wanted the Mexican West, James K. Polk, that this was a rather popular war. But of course, you had a large minority and a large numerical minority, especially of reformers, as we're going to get to next, like the abolitionists and the other reformers were very violently against this war and tried to take a stand against it to no avail. And so when we fought, we sent two armies, one under Zachary Taylor to go in through Coahuila and fight them from the north of Mexico. And then under Winfield Scott, he went the old Cortez route from Veracruz into Mexico City. He's going to take Mexico City and occupy it. Zachary Taylor is going to win actually by Santa Anna giving up at Buena Vista. And the Battle of Chapultepec was a big one. The Battle of Cerro Gordo. These were some big battles that were won by the United States. The United States had technological superiority. They had more soldiers, and and the Mexican people were not united. They ended up having a coup during the war. I kid you not. And so and so it ends with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and America taking it. But the treatment of Mexican Americans after the war, immediately thereafter, during the gold rush, take a look at it in section 2. All right. Look how they were stripped of their land, even though the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo stated they were to keep their land and their rights as citizens. It just didn't end up that way. Take a look. I explained it in section 2, the basics of it. All right. Look for evidence in the press, right? Like the New York Herald, etc., of clear-cut racism directed toward Hispanic people, stereotypes and mythology about these supposedly backward Mexican Latino people. All right. And plenty of evidence of that type of friction during the gold rush. Look up people like Tiburcio Vasquez and, of course, Joaquin Murrieta, that the Legend of Zorro was derived from. And you'll find plenty of evidence of Mexican Americans fighting back. They fought back both within the system. They tried economically to do their best. So like the middle class in San Antonio, Texas, did well. Tucson, Arizona, Santa Fe, New Mexico had a respectable, Hispanic middle class. They fought back as politicians, like Esteban Ochoa, the mayor of Tucson, Arizona, the Gorras Blancas, the White Hats, as a political party and entity in New Mexico and Texas. And they fought back outside the system and actually fighting back as social bandits, like Joaquin Murrieta, trying to stick it back to the Anglo white man by robbing and killing, etc. And you had a famous salt wars in New Mexico. You have, his name is eluding me, Gregorio Cortina and others who fought back literally as well as politically against this Anglo takeover of Hispanics. But there's a lot for conflict historians to cover on number 2, as far as seeing history as conflict, as a dominating bad guy and a victim for whom the historians want you to feel empathy. And of course, in this case, it's the Hispanic people in the far West. What the Hispanic people do very well is they maintain their culture very well, despite the fact that some historians like Ibert and De Leon and other Chicano historians, they use the term proletarianization, all right, saying that the Latin American, the Latino Americans here in the U.S., that, the border, they didn't cross the border crossed them, and that they were pigeonholed into the proletariat. And the proletariat, right, is the manual laboring class. So what do you know? By the mid to the late 1800s and by 1900, a lot of the miners, a lot of the cooks and cleaners, a lot of the migrant workers out on the fields, a lot of the day hands at the ranches, or vaqueros, cowboys, are going to be Hispanic, and they're not going to be paid well, and there's not going to be a great avenue from which they can escape the proletariat. And so, like I said, some fought back within the system, some fought back beyond it, and some and most of them maintained their identity and their culture rather effectively. All right. So in light of the information, the basics that I covered on number 2, right, I'm saying that Turner's thesis does not hold up, that the West was a place of equality of opportunity, right? But that I'm adhering to conflict history, that Hispanic Americans were clearly victimized and they didn't have the same opportunities. And I could have written a similar one about Asian Americans as well, especially during and just after the gold rush, of great discrimination. Not to mention also the minor codes and the minor acts, the taxes, the special minors taxes that were placed upon Hispanic minors and Asian or Chinese minors. All right, so are there any questions? Can I get a thumbs up from anybody? You feel decent on this information? You've been able to hear what I've had to say, and thank you, Fabiola. Thank you. Tricelle, thank you. Thank you, June. All right. So really, those are the basics for this assignment. If you have any other questions, I'll be happy to answer them or do my best in trying to answer them. But if not, that's all I have for this week. We're almost done, you guys. Just a couple more assignments in the final.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome, as always.
Have a good
I appreciate
afternoon.
the turnout. I get a good, decent turnout. And this is the next best thing to being able to meet you in class. So I love it. I'm happy to give you your extra credit points. All right. So if there aren't any other questions, you guys, I'll go ahead and bid you adieu. You guys have a great week. Be careful and good luck on your assignment. Okay.